King of Podcasts Radio Network proudly presents the Broadcasters Podcast. Here is the King of Podcasts.
4 weeks before you wrap up the year, and this is part 2 of the Year in Media 2023 here on the Broadcasters Podcast. Thanks for listening in. kingofpodcasts.com. That's where you find all my content, including this program and all past episodes. And in about 3 weeks, I get to celebrate the 5-year anniversary of the program. It'll be 5 years completed, and we're going to year 6. Yep. Already been like that. It goes by so fast. So when I look at the Year in Media, and I look right now at what's left to go ahead and cover of the year, like we started off last week with the issues with media having just a tumble. Like, I mean, streaming media especially, and the changes that had to be made for subscriptions and pricing and the loss of subscribers and the issues were going on trying to bring in ad-supported media to streaming because now they need to find other ways to keep subscribers around with a lack of content, because then we had the strike. And the strike will need its own episode, but we're going to talk about that probably next week on the program, either next week or the week after, because we'll just go ahead and give one episode just to go ahead and just like uncover what was the strike and what we really got out of it as the full takeaways. Because now, as far as I know, all the agreements have been ratified. Like, they've been signed. It's all done. Writers and actors are back to work. And we look at what happened in the 7 months or so that were 8 months actually that preceded all of it, and everything that happened as a result. Because what really comes down to it is the results and what the writers and actors got at the very end, which they got a lot. They stood their ground in alliance and a concerted effort, a conjoined effort, and they got what they wanted. We're going to talk about what they got out of that and what really came of all that came out of all that. But of course, this program must go back to its bread and butter, what I always got to talk about on a regular basis: radio and music. Because that's where I came from. Like, I did music radio in college and some underground radio stations, and never got to do it until 2019, where I got to finally go and do an actual opportunity to work on content, where I got to work on music radio. It might not have been exactly what I was looking for, but I enjoyed it nevertheless. And so we look at that right now, and I want to make a point as well. I'm going to go into my YouTube channel to go and pull up some clips, some comments that I made throughout the year when it comes to music and radio. And if you're looking for it, look for @King of Podcasts on YouTube, and you'll find everything that I did about music and radio throughout the year on the program. I got a lot of it right there. So when we're going back into that, it really was focused, for the most part, I focused on radio throughout the spring. So March to about, I want to say at the end of May, because by June, we really were starting to get hard hit with the strike, and things just went after that. I mean, I went on radio for a while into mid-June, and where everything was going on. Like, there was such a point where I couldn't help myself. There was just so much going on that I was just not happy about. And we went into it. So many different issues that came about. And so one of the areas I talked about, first of all, was I talked about a story which I was really happy to go and see a lot of playback for. And that was a story that I said was when music was diverse and inclusive, and how the crossover needs to come back. And we went through that story. And I'm telling you, like, for me at that moment, there was a guest column in Billboard that said all music industry professionals need to reflect on the ways in which our industry has perpetuated a system that benefits a select few at the expense of marginalized communities. And what I talked about was that there was such a thing as crossover, but not in the way that maybe current society would call it crossover. But the crossover where we had a mainstream, like, it's almost like how you look at the economic system, where there's people that are rich and poor, and there's a middle class where people kind of merge together. And so what happened was, when we were going through the changes where we had stations that would cater to that, when you had stations that were hits in hip hop, or you had, you know, stations that might have been, it really was that. Like, it was the rhythmic part was always something that kind of stood out, because you'd have stations that would just change things up when it came to allowing other music on the air. Okay, say progressive rock stations that started playing disco music, or started playing soul music, or blues, or jazz. And it was just something to diversify the music that was on the station, because it was free form. So some of those stations definitely opened the eyes and ears to those listening to music with a different look, because we had songs that some of these progressive stations in the 60s and 70s on FM radio would use their platform to open our eyes and ears to new music that we never would have heard in the normal setup of a top 40 station or some other kind of station. Radio was built on that. And then we talked about folks like Frankie Crocker, or we talked about Paco Navarro, right? And then these artists and these hosts that were, you know, of different ethnicities and cultures, and they brought a different flavor. But what happened is that they also enjoyed just new music that didn't have to be within the same confines. So when WBLS came to be and Frankie Crocker was on the air, there were a lot of songs he would play that wouldn't be probably part of the normal setup. And think about some of the artists that we have that, especially when I was listening on Spotify, I was looking at some of the artists that resonated well with being crossed over. So the best examples would be in the 70s and 80s were to the black audience, because there were certain artists that they wanted to be able to cater to a wider variety of audience and play to more people. So I think back to the Soul Train, the hippest trip in America documentary for the VH1 did a couple of years ago. And if you want to look for it, it's on Vimeo, and it's great. And I watch it every so often. Terrence Howard does a documentary. They got a whole lot of time with Don Cornelius and everybody that was dancers on the show and so much more. And one of the segments they talked about was when the show moved to Los Angeles from Chicago, and they were already several years on the air, that some people were just getting not just the biggest soul stars to come on board. What that was happening was that there were requests that Soul Train was so popular that musicians that are big artists wanted to play on Soul Train. They wanted to play. So when you look at right off the bat, Don Cornelius reflects on the fact that Elton John, his people, he wants to do Soul Train. Fine. And Elton John came on and did Soul Train. He did Benny and the Jets. And, you know, Snoop Dogg comes on and comments, oh, you know, sound like a black artist. It sounded like a black man was doing that. And then you have Gino Vanelli, and who was it, Charlie Wilson, I think that says, you know, I thought he was black. You know, I thought most people thought was black. I was one of them. And he did People Gotta Move. And, you know, I Just Want to Stop. All these great songs. The guy's from Montreal. Curly haired, you know, French guy. But, I mean, or no, probably Italian. Vanelli sounds like Italian. But great music. Then you think about David Bowie coming on. He does Fame, and the songs just got like that good funk soul groove to it. The Average White Band. Like, there's all these different artists that crossed over. And you think the same way where certain genres of music are able to cross over. Like right now, currently, what we do have a little bit of crossover in current music right now is Afro beats. There are a couple of songs that might make their way into the charts, and all of a sudden Tyla comes into the play, which is not so much, somewhat Afro beats, but more R&B. Rema has come out and had a big song with Calm Down that spread over 2 years when Selena Gomez got on the remix. And then artists used to do that all the time. It was really common for a lot of artists to perform, and when their songs hit the charts, it would be at the top of the soul charts and the top of the charts, the mainstream charts. So there would be crossover. They would cross over into different charts, and that's what it was. And there were artists in the 80s that did the same thing. You know, Hall & Oates constantly had songs that hit to the R&B charts. Same thing for Jake Osband, had a song called Flamethrower, hit into the top 20 of the R&B charts. And there's various other examples where you hear music that's like, wow, that's like, okay. And all of a sudden, songs that just resonate with a larger audience, they might be in an underground or like a much more a more niche driven market, But some songs make it through the ether, break through, and cross over into other charts, other stations, and all of that. And that was something that we had constantly going on. And it was just amazing what we had. And also the same thing goes with crossover artists that were in genres that would have been, that some people would have thought, this is kind of a stereotypical feel. So, for instance, Living Color, Cult of Personality. And that song, and you see who's performing on Arsenio Hall. Okay, first of all, Arsenio Hall was a crossover show. Okay, having Radiohead and having, various artists of whatever there was that was popular to a very urban audience, but it didn't matter, right? And then I look at what they had all that great music going on, and we were just living it and just enjoying it. But when I saw that article, I really said to myself, man, there's something to be said about that, but I wanted to go ahead and push back and talk about that. There was already a legacy of crossover that we had for a long time.
So in the story, she writes and says that it's time for us to embrace a new paradigm, one that values skill and merit over relationships and aristocratic privilege and nepotism for just those who knows somebody who knows somebody. She writes that the music industry finds itself on the brink of disruption, and we must recognize that our long-standing history of exploiting disenfranchised groups isn't compatible with our espoused values of social justice and inclusivity. Now, the reason we're at this, Janicia, is because, remember, all these other record labels that were out there, a cacophony, there's a nice Scrabble word for you, of record labels were out there that were not under the thumb of a major publisher. But remember, we have, 3 major publishers now? What is it, Sony, BMG, and Universal, right? They control everything. When you create the deregulation, just like for radio, just like for television, when you get only so many companies that run everything going on, then that's the problem. No wonder there's no chance of that. And then what happens is, just like corporations don't understand, which is the focus of this program, the fact of the matter is that the digital disruption has affected music as well. They could have controlled things. Listen, they could have made some kind of control over keeping physical units on the shelves and still selling physical units, but they did not. They completely ignored what the internet was doing. Then came Napster. Then came Spotify. Everything else comes into play. Then comes iTunes. It's not in that particular order, but you know what I'm talking about. The digital disruption continues to go and run amok.
Now, I go back and talk about that. And just in the last couple of months, I've been watching some documentaries that actually talked really about artists and music that just crossed over into other genres and just for other people. So, for instance, one of the documentaries I always go back to so much is a BBC documentary called The Story of Ready, Steady, Go, which was what Shindig was back in the 60s to fans here. It was not so much what American Bandstand was. It was kind of like it was 30-minute show, and the hottest artists that were going on performed. And it was a weekly show. So it was kind of an American Bandstand, but then this was the predecessor to what would be Top of the Pops, what BBC Radio or BBC Television would run, in 1964. But before that, Ready, Steady, Go was run by Associated Rediffusion in the UK, and the show went out for several years. I think it was 1963. So it was at the start of, the British invasion, the Beatles, the Pacemakers, the Animals, the Zombies, all of it. And then what happened was that because of certain influential people that were very close to the program, one was Dusty Springfield. She was tapped into what was going on in America with Motown records. And because of her, not just Motown, but artists from Stax, like, Otis Redding, would make their way over, cross the Atlantic, and perform in England. And all of a sudden, here we go. Big time going on. And artists would cross over. And a completely different audience was exposed. Motown, you had Martha and the Vandellas, you had Diana Ross and the Supremes, Stevie Wonder, so many others that came through across that way. And that's what happened. James Brown made his way over across the Atlantic. And like what happened was Britain became a market for soul music. And it was so prominent for years that so many artists there was a whole thing about Northern Soul that, before we had dance music or disco in the mid to late 70s, the late 60s into early 70s, the British teens were all dancing to Northern Soul. It was just all these rare soul records that would be crossed over across the Atlantic, that we were brought over from American record stores, odd tracks, and they would go and bring these records over to play them as new. And some of the things that would happen to be crossed over when it came to music for what would become disco, there was all this different music that came across that crossed over. And then when those songs went into the dance clubs, they somehow made their way onto the radio stations, and then somehow made their way onto records, and everybody was catching them, listening to them, and everybody caught on. It was a wonderful thing. It was so organic, and nobody had an ear of like, okay, where's this person from? Because a lot of times certain artists you would never see on television. And then by the time you heard about the song of the record, you would not even know what the artist looks like. And you might see him on TV for the first time. You're like, oh, that's where he or she looks like. And then it changes. And nobody thinks anything about it. It was one of those stories that really stood out to me. And like I said, I go back and I catch that episode. Now, the episode was back in March 18th, episode 270. I'd recommend to go back and listen to that, because it was really a fun time going on, what we had in terms of music and what was going on with it. Now, moving along, we're talking about radio removing real talent for AI inferiority. And that was the part where we had a couple of major market talents that were let go after a long time of being on the air. Axl Lowe at 99X in Atlanta, and Jack Harris at WFLA in Tampa. And these kind of stories I read, and I'm like, what in the world, man? It's sad, but it's what happened. And I'm trying to remember what happened, but you know what? I didn't realize it was like 1 week. I did not do the show from March 18th into March 31st. I did not do a show. I don't think I did. If I go back and look, I'm just looking right now on my calendar. Maybe I got to put an episode up, and I didn't have it up there. Oops. I don't know what I did. I got to go look. I'm doing this while we're doing this live, folks. I know it doesn't matter. I'm just going to take a look real quick. Did I really remember not to do an episode? No. It was one of those weeks I absolutely was sick. And one of the few times this year I would ever miss a week of the Broadcasters Podcast. But, let me just be honest here. I did a lot of extra shows. Just so you remember, I aired all those interviews I did with Lou Pate on radio that referred to media. So I did those episodes, and I gave you some extra things in there. So I even though I might have missed 1 week, a rare occurrence for yours truly to do that, but that's happened, and that's what I took care of. So like a couple of weeks later, we talked about radio removing real talent for AI inferiority. And that pissed me off when I saw that story. So here's what I said back on that episode. Again, that's March 31st of this year.
And I can't tell you many times how many people I've known in radio that just feel disheartened and are disappointed and just feel like, what happened to the love? What happened to the enjoyment of being in front of a microphone and doing this? Even though I'm doing the same thing, I'm running with a broadcast quality mic right now in the studio in my home, which is nice, it's convenient, but still, it's not like the radio studio. It's not like what I used to do before. Having the board, having the controls, having all that music, the resources at my disposal, having other people at my side, camaraderie, having fun, the camaraderie of the studios, having that atmosphere of fun and party and just having a great time. What happened to that? We know corporations will continue to take away that kind of creativity, take away that kind of atmosphere. As we know, that just continues to go along since 1996. I talked about it. But it's not going to sting any less as long as it keeps happening. As long as they have to continue to see stories that continue to talk about the deterioration of radio, of the foundation that this business was built upon. And for those that are around, in some cases like our first feature story, 50 years on the air, and how you give this guy the most insensitive send-off with no chance to listen. Listen, I don't expect Jack Harris to get the Scott Sheehan send-off. Okay, I get that, but you don't send this guy out like that.
The thing was that retort right there, for some people that have gone on the radio now, well, you don't realize that, it's like people don't realize what radio was actually like. For those of you that wanted to be in a radio career and get yourself on the radio, you don't realize what it was like, what it was really like. Maybe you heard the stories. Maybe you watched the movie FM. Maybe you watched WKRP in Cincinnati. Maybe you watched news radio and you saw the kind of fun and things that were going on with that. But no. Maybe you even saw Frasier. You would have seen that as well. But no, this was all different. We had those kind of stories come out. And we had some pretty big names that dropped out of radio that, Scott Shannon retiring once again. And just saying to myself, man, some of the legendary folks by the wayside that still know how to do great radio, either being let go or just stepping down, hanging up the microphones. And what's going to be left after that? All these people that don't have any kind of real resonation, right? Of course, not everyone has to be like, with a cigar, with a cigarette, like a 2-pack a day cigarette habit to have that voice, right? I understand that. But those that just understood the music, understood the, entertaining your audience in the most primitive form. But people don't worry about that anymore. People don't even think about that now. So that's another part. And then in April, I talked about the music industry massacre of 2023. So if it's not TikTok, it's AI or fake streams. And the industry and labels are taking in a lot of incoming attacks. And the digital disruption was really taking a toll on the music industry because you could see things were just changing about it. We know that streaming services are now looking to go and increase their prices. Spotify already did. And I believe iTunes already did. So we're getting that part. SiriusXM making some changes to their cost and more of that. But that was going on constantly, rampantly, just changing. Now, one thing I want to bring up before we go into that is a current story. Radio Inc. did put out from Edison Research, they recapped the top radio findings of 2023. So the share of ear data in the second quarter of 2023, Edison's research unveiled a pivotal moment in audio consumption that on-demand content surpassed linear audio for the first time. Now, let me explain that to you. In this, they're saying 50.3% of daily audio consumption among those 13 years and older came from on-demand platforms. And it was something that, it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't that long ago that we were talking about that this was going to be a day that was going to happen. And that on-demand was going to beat live. It's happened now. It's official. More than 50% of daily audio consumption from ages 13 and older are from on-demand platforms. So that is podcasts, audiobooks, and your streaming services. The 49% comes from linear platforms, which is over-the-air radio, AM/FM radio, satellite radio, and streaming radio services. 7.5 years ago, linear listening led by 38 percentage points. So the rise of on-demand content is due to the increasing popularity of podcasts, the preference for selecting specific songs or playlists over traditional radio or linear streams. Now, Edison Research doesn't want to say that linear listening is facing extinction, but it holds value for many, and even on-demand listeners engage with it, that on-demand audio is expected to persist into the future. So, a major watershed moment. Now, more than half of the audience for radio, they're not listening to what you're doing live. They're not. Just like the same thing we're seeing with cord cutting. People are not watching what's live in terms of, in real time network cable TV, unless it's live sports, the rare occasion. But now the changes, we now have the pendulum going the other way, swinging in the other direction. Mobile radio listening is gaining traction. So because of smartphones and digital devices, that 63% of Americans still engage with AM, FM radio content daily, because now they're not listening just on their car stereos or onto radios, because they have radios on their phones and digital devices. And 84% of data listeners still use traditional radio sets for over-the-air content, which is basically cars. Spoken word has hit a new high. This is Edison along with NPR collaborating on a spoken word audio report. And the audience share has grown by 55% over the last 9 years. 48% of respondents now engage with spoken word content. So talk or, documentaries or, scripted content. And the average daily listening time at home has risen to 41 minutes in 2023. And for the first time, mobile devices have taken over traditional platforms as the primary medium for spoken word audio, particularly at home. And when it comes to podcasts, it's got more of a diverse audience. So data found that about half of Black podcast listeners do so at home. A third of the audience listen to podcasts on the go. There's an increase in time spent on podcast listening, with many dedicating over 5 hours per week, contrasting the declining trend of less frequent listening, amounting to less than an hour weekly. And kids are becoming more loyal listeners to podcasts. 70% of parents report their children initiating podcast sessions, and nearly half of these children are listening weekly and 67% monthly. Well, interesting stories that came out of that, but radio is losing their grip on that majority. 97% of people listen to radio at least once a week. That bullshit line we hear all the time that we've talked about on this program. No, come on. So we talked about the music industry massacre of 2023, which is prominent and it's real. And I made some comments on that as well.
But these issues are what's hurting the music industry. I try to listen to new music all the time. There's not a lot of pop music I like right now. There's very little rock music that I can really enjoy, because some of the alternative artists, they might have a feel to it, but it's just not rock. It doesn't have it's not, smash and grab. Kind of give me like a good thumping, guitar riff, and, give me the drums, give me all this, like, really rampant. We're not, because the alternative artists don't really do that. They're still very much digital. Don't get me wrong, Arctic Monkeys can come out with a good record. Bring Me the Horizon, Arcade Fire. Those are a couple of good examples, right? Imagine Dragons for quite a while. We saw them. Heat Waves, Glass Animals, right? But really, that variety of music. See, here's the thing. I don't want to be one of those people that says, you know what, the 90s to 2000s, we had such variety. Yes, we did. We absolutely did. But where is it now? Why don't we have it? Like, what happened? I want to figure that out, because I don't see it right now, and it's a problem. I don't want it to be this way either. I want better music. I want more music to listen to, but we're not. We're in a state of flux right now, where there's music out there to be played, but man, there's not much to work with, and I don't like this.
Still don't like it. If I had to go and look right now, I don't know if the year-end chart for 2023 has come out for Billboard. I need to go and look and see if they have one, but maybe they do already have one. Oh, yeah, actually, they have gotten to it. Here we go. So the current point of the year-end charts, if I look for the Hot 100 songs for the year, I'm going to be somewhat disappointed. Last Night by Morgan Wallen is by far #1 song of 2023. But here's the other songs we had that just sat around for so long and nothing else came from it. Like Flowers, Miley Cyrus, they came out, I think it was the very start of the year, and that's it. Kill Bill, SZA, Antihero, Taylor Swift, which was actually in 2022. Creepin', Metro Boomin, Weekend of 21 Savage, number 5. Calm Down, remix Selena Gomez, which is again 2019 song in October. 6. Die For You, Weekend Ariana Grande, which was a song that was brought back to make a remix because Ariana Grande decided to jump on a remix. 8. Fast Car, Luke Combs. 9. SZA with Snooze. And 10. I'm Good Blue, David Guetta, BB Rexa. That's your top 10 for the year. When you look at what's that, identifying the artists on that group right there, right? So there's what? 1 hip hop song, 3 R&B songs technically. You have 2 pop songs, 1 dance song, and 2 country songs. And by the way, all those songs, well, there was just so much time in between them, and you're in a list that just had so much there. It was just, and you look at who's up there at the very top, and the room for other artists to make their way up on the top there that were basically really independent, it's really hard to get to. Because some of what you saw in here, it's a lot of major artists that were just, there was nobody that really came in that could have been from an independent label or came in out of nowhere. Like, how many new artists do we have on this list that really just like, all of a sudden, here we go. Somebody just really came up out of nowhere. Like, I'm looking right now, from the 100 all the way up to number 1. I'm looking, Peso Pluma. That's one artist that all of a sudden this year came out of nowhere. And then we had Callie with Area Codes, but that, pretty much she's a one-off. She's a one-hit wonder. That looks like that's going to be for her. Jungkook branching out and being a solo star now out of BTS. That's another thing. Noah Kahan. That's another artist that has made his way in and is pretty much, significant. We had Richmond, north of Richmond, Oliver Anthony. That's a new artist that came out of nowhere. Doechii, who was featured with Kodak Black, who once again got himself in trouble. That was a song that got very big onto commercial radio. Zach Bryan had a banner year for himself for country. And I look and I continue to see, okay, Ice Spice, she was already kind of making her way, but now she definitely was out there this year. It was a breakout for her this year. And if I keep going here, we see the return of Doja Cat. That was important to see her coming back. Cupid, 50/50. That song got pretty prominent and did pretty well. And if I look at who else there was that really just stood out and just like, we had some new names that were into the mix that just came out of nowhere. No, we had Sure Thing by Miguel, a song from 2014 that made its way back up because of TikTok. But that was one thing. We had Tusi with Favorite Song. That was an artist that came in, but also pretty big push by radio. Pink Pantheress made a strong start of the year jump with Boys Are Part 2. And like I said, like, not a lot of new artists that got into the mix and made their way up into the chart and really were significant for this year. Not much. And that is a testament to where music right now in the music industry is. It's unfortunate. And then I made a part about AM radio dying a slow death with a lot of static because there was a lot of issues where radio is going to be taken out of infotainment dashboards, and Congress had to come in and try to save AM radio from being thrown away. The other story I have was that I brought into, like, if I want to bring out music, I guess I talked about Peso Pluma and the regional Mexican push in the music mainstream, which all of a sudden Bala Sola and then like all these other songs that he came up with his own album. And for the summer, regional Mexican was kind of in. It's kind of died down now. It's definitely not held up like I thought it might have been, because I think just kind of, it was just the summer of corridos and that was what happened. And I think the mainstream audience just kind of just let it by the wayside, because for Peso Pluma, you can only do so much what they had. Fuerza Regida and all these other artists that came on board, Grupo Frontera, like they all came in, and you had some of the mainstream artists like a Bad Bunny or a Shakira or a Becky G or, whatever, all trying to jump in on that bandwagon. And then it ended. And I mentioned how music radio new music on corporate radio is dying. And I went on to that. That was going back to May 12th. Let me go and give you an idea what I was thinking about at that time.
As I said before on this program, I can go back to past episodes, and I can talk about the fact of how discovery, and I've used that word several times. I'm going to just give you some reference. The new normal of new music discovery, back June 10th, 2022, and July 1st, 2022, okay? Now, it was right after Stranger Things. This time last year, remember, Stranger Things came out, season 4, and Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill, and Metallica's Master of Puppets, all of a sudden they got viral again. And Kate Bush and Running Up That Hill. Like, remember, how high did that song get? Let me just make sure to bring that up again. A Deal with God, Running Up That Hill. As remember, if we look back at last year at what that did, Wikipedia will tell me the story about how the chart came out. So, the original release of Running Up That Hill with the number 3 on the UK singles chart, number 30 on the Billboard Hot 100 in the United States, 30. And it was Kate Bush's first top 40 hit. And then it received renewed attention when it was featured on the 4th season of Netflix series Stranger Things. The song's resurgence went up the charts around the world, and radio was serviced again by popular demand. The United Kingdom, the song hit number 1 for 3 weeks. 7 weeks in Ireland, Australia for 9 non-consecutive weeks. And on the Billboard Hot 100, it hit number 3. A song, 27 years later? And remember, one of my most popular episodes, I talked about that. And the Kate Bush fans came from the woodwork talking about that episode and loved it. Like, I still go back and I look back and I was thinking, wow, people were so happy about that, because there was plenty of comments to say about that at that time. It was so wonderful. Like, I was really so happy to see that. And people just commented and loved it. And I was like, wow. And I go back and one more time, let me just go back to this again. When that song came out and went back up to the charts again, like, it was just relentless. It was incredible. And I never get comments on my YouTube feed. Not that many. I wish that anybody can still do that, by the way. Can still do that. YouTube.com/ or at King of Podcasts on YouTube. And a link is on the website. You can actually look at the videos. You can actually watch it from there. Broadcasterspodcast.com. Now, the comments. Actually, that site's gone now. Plethora of comments. Loved it. Oh my God, it was great. But then what happened was, those are anomalies. But that's a song from the past. But the thing was, for many people, it was new music discovered again. But that's because listening on the radio can literally be discovering new music again. Now, for those who were listening that were younger and listened to that song, we never really paid attention to it. But that song acted like it was new again. And it did. The fact that it was number 1 again across the board in the UK and all around Europe. And number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 of all. Loved it. It was fantastic.
It's one of those anomalies. But of course, with a show like Stranger Things and the kind of impact it has, it was something that really said a lot. So, what can I say? We just had a run with it. And it was just a big difference and a big change. Now, we don't get anything the year end of the year. No, do we have one? Let's see. We didn't get a year end of what did well in terms of what songs went the highest this year. I don't think we had anything like that came up. I wish we did, though. It would be nice to go and see like what they actually had in terms of what the charts were at the time. But it doesn't look like we have anything like that right now. It's too bad. Otherwise, I would love to see it. But there's like songs that I hear on TikTok, and all of a sudden I'm just like, you know what? Now I'm starting to gravitate towards them because TikTok does such a good job of presenting music. And as clips as opposed to videos, like full-fledged music videos, it really does work. And I think of all these different artists I listen to that all of a sudden, man, I'm hearing new music I would have never heard in radio. But radio should have been doing the job. But they're not. And by the way, since I got my car, I got a new car about a month ago. And I'm saying to myself, I went back, put radio back on because you know what? The AM/FM radio in the car, the stereo system actually is really good. So if I want to listen to AM/FM radio, it sounds good. So I decided, let me change the stations on. I put all the presets on. And it's the same thing over and over. And what that leads me to is what came up with music. Okay, there was the part of record labels rigging radio airplay. We talked about the issue once again of the kind of payola stuff that was going on with record labels on radio airplay charts coming under scrutiny. Targeted payments, overnight spins. We talked about that ad nauseum. And then the week after that, May 26th, I talked about radio retreats through throwbacks and surrenders of the new music to the streamers because certain stations decided, well, we're not going to go up against with the fact that we can't play new music in a certain amount of time. We're just going to admit the fact that, no, we're not made for new music. You know, the corporate system will not allow us to play certain music until it gets about 9, 10, 12 weeks down the line, where it's been viral for that much long through digital means, through social media, or through streaming services. Because while those songs will reach their peak, by the time it's on the downslide or already basically off the map of streaming, radio comes in and piggybacks it. And for whatever reason, Billboard's charts continue to give radio a majority of the scoring as to what songs make it to the top of the charts. Because that Hot 100 year-end list is full of songs that were prominent on radio. But if we really talked about what the audience was really listening to, and the fact that radio still has a significance because Billboard and other entities allow it to be. One of the things I want to take, and I really want to see happen, is what will become of radio when we get to the point that the royalties come into play, right? As I said, we have various bills that are being circulated right now in Congress. And if one of those bills, or also one of the court cases with BMI or ASCAP, the copyrights organizations that service all the artists, first of all, initially songwriters, and then the artists will get their royalties. If the royalties get amped up for radio stations, they're done. And these big corporate conglomerates will not be able to survive. And that will be a great day, ladies and gentlemen. It will be a wonderful day. A couple other stories I want to bring up in the local end before we go and wrap things up. That came up in the new, that I could find a few in the ether of, current media. Let me bring up radio here where Odyssey has been given more time to pay down debt and avoid bankruptcy. Well, all right. So, Philadelphia Business Journal reports the extension comes as the company tries to reach an agreement with lenders to restructure its debt to avoid bankruptcy. Yeah, just give them more time. So they missed a $17 million debt repayment due on October 31st and another one on October 8th. Odyssey, had the audacity to seek and receive a 30-day grace period extended by 10 days. And they have a third debt payment set for due September 28th. All three payments were part of the latest extension. So they have to go and pay this. And this is all while they are restructuring $1.9 billion in debt and gaining financial breathing room. The latest repayment extensions come after JP Morgan and Chase stepped down late last month from its role in covering Odyssey's defaulted loans should the company not be able to repay its debt. Chase removed itself as the company's letter of credit and swing line lender. And if Odyssey failed to make payments, Chase would have been on the line to provide that swing line loan that they gave to them. They've been on the dole for it. Now, Odyssey, as of the third quarter, according to their financial statements, they have $57.4 million in cash or cash equivalents. So they have enough cash to cover the debt due in the coming months. It still has more debt to pay down, including almost $1 billion in debt set to mature next year, and they're losing money in recent years as advertising demand has fallen off since the pandemic began. So with all this going on, the royalties being hit up and amplified can only make it to where we need to go ahead and cut this off. It's time for Odyssey and iHeartRadio to start unloading their stations, and that local radio owners take these stations on and start programming them properly. Odyssey has 220 radio stations in the country. Let's let them go. Remember, they lost their spot on the New York Stock Exchange. They're a pink stock now. They got delisted May 16th. Another big story that we talked about on the program. That was just a mess for them. But that's what happened to them. What are you going to do about it? Another story that got my attention. Gen Z gets this news from TikTok. This is from Business Insider. A Pew Research Center poll says that 14% of U.S. adults get their news regularly from TikTok, up from 3% in 2020. And 18 to 29-year-olds, the number jumped from 9% to 32%. And news on TikTok rarely comes from mainstream outlets like Washington Post or ABC News. They're trying to build audiences there, but the recommendation algorithm pushes users towards other accounts. Young people on TikTok learn about what's happening from a hodgepodge of alternative sources, from commentary to accounts like non-news influencers who occasionally dabble in current events when they enter the mainstream, to posts from people purporting to offer on-the-ground videos from breaking news events like a war or protest. So another story, they also make a point where what happens when a generation of Americans gets their news from an infinitely scrolling video app? The 24-hour news cycle becomes a 24-second news cycle. TikTok's growing news influence could further batter an already severely wounded media industry and a potential dramatic effect on an informed public. So they're trying to say that the ability to provide accurate information on current events is being tested in real time. Now, another story came out is the media industry in decline. We talked about it earlier. Media industry jobs hit 20,000 year to date. So remember, we had 20,000 plus media industry jobs cut, highest since 2020. 20,324 cuts. This is according to a report from employment firm Challenger, Gray and Christmas. News lost 13.2%, or 2,681 cuts, higher than the last 2 years. And among those layoffs included NPR, Washington Post, BuzzFeed, Vox, Texas Tribune, and Condé Nast's Wired, Pitchfork, and Ars Technica, and so much more. A lot of jobs. It's a good chunk. So the corporate news industry is hurting, or the media industry as well as hurting, with the amount of jobs that are not available. So people are not necessarily looking at the career media to be in an establishment. It's going to be online more than anything else. But I mean, now people are just becoming much more multi-platform, multi-versatile on reporting on media, because you have to, if you want to be really a media entity that's going to come into play. But that's the room now for more alternative media, which is not a bad thing. Yeah, we like to make sure it's accurate, but do we want to believe that everything that's being said on a media establishment is true, or is it just editorial? We can talk about that too, but there's quite a bit of that going on as well. And maybe I'm going to take a clip from one of the episodes I took from an interview I did for Podcasters Row. I talked to the folks that host a San Francisco conservative. A couple of questions I asked a former journalist, really a former media expert, worked as a producer, worked as a host, as a reporter for a lot of major news networks, and the change in media today. I might bring that up and put it as a clip on the program. I'll think about it. I'll let you know what I come up with anyway. But that's the program for tonight. That's part 2 of the year in media. We're going to do with part 3, and most likely we'll go ahead and bring up the strikes, the labor unions making their way and going up head to head with the big Hollywood gorilla, the 500-pound gorilla that is Hollywood, and be able to go ahead and take them to the point where they're able to get what they really wanted. Able to keep their jobs, worry about AI, worry about residuals, and get more money for them and get better concessions. The most concessions they could possibly get this time around, because there were significant changes going on with the technology that needed to be addressed this time around. It could not wait. They couldn't ask for the bare minimum. They had to do something now. And that's what they did. So we'll go ahead and focus back on what happened then here on the program. But thank you for listening in. And always, you know where you can find everything that goes on with this show. kingofpodcasts.com. kingofpodcasts.com is where everything's at. And so make sure to go there. And please do also follow me on social media. I put clips up every week of the program. So TikTok, X, formerly Twitter, Threads, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, all that there. And I don't know, there's not much else to say. It's the end of the year. We're just kind of chilling. We're relaxing. All right, anyway, we'll do another Broadcasters podcast next week. Until then, remember the content is king. And the control of your content is in your hands.